You know what's interesting too is, well, I think too, like, not that this is what we were talking about.
Stars and
Well, not that this is what we were talking
Man
about.
on the Moon.
So what do you think about this? So I want to. So okay, so I've had this kind of in the back of my head, right? So if someone is to curse, right? Like let's say I'm hot or I'm angry. Well, so if me and you are arguing and I'm like, you're a dumb egg, right? And I call you a name, right? I throw a curse word out that way, right? Versus Elon Musk that day when he was sitting on that panel and the guy for Disney was out there and they were talking about kind of trying to strong arm him and forcing him to advertise or not advertise for certain people. And it was kind of like a strong arm play. And he was like, and they were like, what'd you tell him? He's like, F you. He's like, that's what I told him, F you. And then he said, hey, Bob, if you're in the audience, right? And it was the guy who was trying to strong arm him. And I saw Christians, like, they didn't know what to do with that, right? Because they were like, oh, he said F you. And so, again, it's, could you have used better speech there? Potentially. But I think, too, like, and I've thought about this a lot, like, he wasn't necessarily cursing out of anger or a lack of self-control. He was trying to communicate with intensity, like, this is what I feel about you trying to strong arm me, right? And so, like, I think personally that the way that me calling you an a-hole out of maybe excitement or over aggressively or something like that is worse than potentially what Elon Musk did, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. So, in the moment you're saying he's confronting a real principled situation, but he's using that language. Well, there's this is basically the same or similar circumstance and same principle as, a current controversy in sort of the Reformed evangelical world specifically, or, they have Doug Wilson on the radar and everything coming out of there. And so they have an ad for their college that has, I believe the ad has a picture of Johnny Cash flipping a bird, and he says, and they're trying to recruit young men who would come to New St. Andrews. And it says something along the lines of calling all the young men who want to give Johnny Cash's favorite finger to all the tyrants out there. And, there's more to it than that, but yet.
A lot of people
they're like, no, that's
Sunday school are like,
oh, yeah, and this is like a Christian college, and you're using that imagery to advertise and promote. That's ungodly. And so there's some interesting back and forth, and to hear, that crowd around Doug talk about their motivations for things like that, and what they call their serrated edge, and using wit or sarcasm or humor or irony or maybe in more intense or severe forms of James,
with the book of James, because that's what an evangelical Christian is going to say. Well, when I was in Sunday school, being brought up, there's this thing in the book of James about the language, about my tongue, so how do I read that? And then what would Douglas Wilson and that crowd say to that of like, because I know they have a reason, like they're not just going, oh, we just ignore James, right? I mean, I'm not going they don't do that.
Yeah, right. Well, and it's a more kind of nuanced, complex conversation. Are there a lot of directions you could go in, and you could talk about obviously the fundamentals of our morality, but then at some point our moral imperatives as Christians in our own lives are going to run up against the reality of evil in the world. And what do we do in the face of that? And this is a big part of the nature of our ongoing conversation. Same thing as.
So I thought this would be a good conversation.
We see these things happening out there in the world or in Christianity, and we comment on it, and we're interested in that. And people are drawn to some of these movements of Christians, like you were just saying, and kind of preparing for today, because they're speaking into these issues. They're having something to say, even if it's imperfectly. We're daring to wrestle with these ideas and not sit by quietly. So I would say in wielding the sword, it's for a purpose. Even if that sword is the one of our tongue, because James says that how dangerous the tongue is, it can set the world ablaze. And so, but a man who can control the tongue is pursuing perfection. And so if you can execute the use of language in a self-controlled and precise way, even if it, evokes more emotion or is somehow a crude form of language in some way, but yet it's powerful. It's effective in that moment. So you're not just, if out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks, then if you stub your toe and you just blurt out 4-letter words, then of course you lack control, or somebody cuts you off in traffic, or you observe the political situation around us. You are rightly incensed at that. But what do you do next? What do you say in response to that? And if through understanding the ideas, you can craft a message, and if along the way it is lined with some pointy barbs, it gets people's attention, and it's effective and useful. And so there's a distinction to be made, and again, our imperfection, our flesh enters into the equation, and so
because
there's no perfect examples.
Because it felt incredibly appropriate, right? And it didn't feel appropriate to my flesh. It felt appropriate to the moment when Elon did that, right? When he said that on that stage. And I guess for me, the reason I think it's an interesting...
It was a principle to FU.
Yeah, absolutely.
There was a lot behind it. Yeah, a lot behind it. Not just, you offended me in the moment.
Well, it wasn't just about me either, right? It wasn't about, hey, it's about me. No, it's about free speech. It's about our country. It's about the people in the country.
When you're using a type of...
He was responding to
rhetoric.
Evil, right?
They're trying to impose upon you then this ethical standard that you're the one failing in this moment to do the right thing. And it's like, F you, no, you're the one who is doing this evil thing.
Exactly. And so I guess there's this part of me that,
it's an emphatic no.
And I was bothered for weeks because right behind that, you had Dana White, who is the CEO of the UFC, and he had someone that called him, and he tells this story on a couple different podcasts. But he had a sponsor that called him, and after he walked out with Donald Trump, right at the UFC, and they called him and said, "Hey, you need to take that video down now." Right, to which Dana said, "You know what I told him?" And he was like, "What? And he's like, "F you, like you don't tell me who to vote for, you don't tell me how to live my life, right?" Like, I'm going to do what I want to do, and you do what you want to do. This is America, and we're not going there, right? And so I take the Dana White, and it's a much funnier story. I encourage you to go watch it. Then you have Tucker Carlson, who had the same experience. And I guess what I'm saying is there's this division in American Christianity, right? And I think this division is why you see a lot of tension between two sides of Christianity. Why is it that it takes the worldly men to face off against the evil? Elon Musk, Dana White, Tucker's getting there, but he hasn't historically lived that life. He'll tell you, right? But he's coming into it. He's Catholic and he's coming back around to it. But why is it's taking these men who have the tenacity to face off against this evil? And we kind of are more sitting. I'm not saying there's not men that aren't doing it, but it seems as if this is and it's like, and then we're over here going, oh, but you need to, and this is what drives me crazy, by the way. Even with me, people do this with me all the time. It drives me crazy. Do I do everything right all the time? No, I don't. But playing Monday morning quarterback with me, you're going to have a bad day, right? I mean, I hear it all the time. It's like, oh, well, you should have did it this way. And I'm like, well, you should have did something, right? Like, I'm so sick of you telling me how I should have did it. You should have just did anything, right?
Yeah, it's like, Christians will be like, but these immoral guys are out there defending us. I don't like it. How dare they? Why are you cheering for the guys defending us? Because they're immoral.
Yes. And so I go back to all of this, and I'm kind of talking about this because I think this is what happened with Trump a little bit. I think Trump got bitter towards the Christian community a little bit when he had that win over Roe versus Wade. And we just kind of went, yeah. That's all we did. Yeah. Like that was it. Like it wasn't like, well, yeah.
It varies. It varies, but in reality, yeah.
On a bigger scale, as the evangelical,
voice,
that's right. As an evangelical voice, we were just kind of like, yeah.
And the mainstream voice. I mean, there are those people that probably were already Trump supporters that now,
but what would the left
put that
have done?
On their list. Oh, they'd still be their champion.
They'd still be champion, right?
I mean, there would be already shrines built all across the nation.
And I think that's where Christians, and I get like we're not building shrines and making idols, right? I get that. But Christians also, we kind of sideline ourselves, right? And how do we not like praise? And I think praise is appropriate when a man takes down Roe versus Wade, which has been a problem in this country for over 50 years, right? And it's a victory for life. The thing that we say, it's not a victory for Trump or Republican. No, it's a victory for life.
Babies are not dying.
That's right. And so it's like, how are we not praising someone that went to bat, fought that fight, and got it done? A lot of people told us they would, but somebody actually did it, right? I don't care if it's Trump or anybody else, but like we as Christians have to get more in the game in this way, which is going to lead us into today's conversation, which is politics and religion, right? Like there seems to be two really bad ways in which people view these things, right? You have this one community in the Christian church that almost feels like it needs to be theocratic. We need to come down with a power hammer. Theocracy needs to rule, right? And it's like, and the left has done a good job at painting people like Douglas Wilson and those people that claim to be a Christian nationalist, as myself, I do. But as soon as I say that, you're like, tune out, because you don't know what the definition of, because you've allowed the enemy to define the term, right?
Well, and there's not a concrete definition.
Yeah,
there's a working definition.
There's a working definition.
We would want to just define for ourselves what we believe anyway,
absolutely.
Rather than just try to conform it to some label.
So you have that side that is very much in the fight, and then there's a group that's very theocratic, and they think it needs to be a top-down power. But then you have the other another side that I think is altogether unhealthy, which is like no the religion and politics, separation of church and state. They've bought into that lie, right? Which is very much a lie in and of itself too, right? And they've allowed that rhetoric to divide out and go, worship is for Sunday morning in your church. It's not for the world. It's not for politics. It's not for education. It's not for these institutions, right? These are very divided things. And so I think you have both these camps, and there's a middle that is healthy, right? There's a middle that is good, right? And it's even good for,
we're talking about within Christianity. You're making these
I'm making these distinctions, inside the family of God.
Yeah, because right? That's important too.
No, for sure.
Along the way, I'm sure we'll make further distinctions.
Yes.
Of those outside.
Right. Because I would argue that even what we're talking about is a greater blessing to the people outside the family of God too. Right. Sure. The camp of no God above government has never worked out for people outside the family of God either. Which we can get there.
If there's no God above government, then government is your God.
Is your God. That's exactly right.
And at the heart of that is humanism, secular humanism. And again, these are just labels that are terms that do have a more agreed upon historic meaning, maybe more so than Christian nationalism currently, but yet at the heart of secular humanism is simply just the original sin of putting ourselves in the position of God and wanting.
And it has all kinds of consequences downstream that people don't want to.
Whatever you believe has consequences,
has
and I think that's one of the most fundamental things to
about this conversation.
With. No matter what we're talking about,
what we believe. What are governments? Governments are groups of a collection of people. Right, that they form a government, right? That's what you're doing. You're coming together and forming government to.
Well, you have a certain rule or authority.
That's right.
However, it's constituted, upon what basis. So, but there have been many different forms of that, all throughout history.
But in those forms, here's the question I'm going to ask you. In those forms, right? So a collection of people get together to form a government. And what is one of the first things that they do? They institute
a law,
laws,
a rule.
Okay. Where do those come from? Right. This is what we're driving at, right? Where do those come from? Where do laws and rules come from? Because the laws and rules of our land is not the same as another land, right? I mean, like there's boundaries, there's borders, there should be anyways, which is a whole nother conversation. But like, what are those? Like, where do those come from, right? And this is really what we're talking about. We're talking about the division or separation of church and state. Like, okay, if you separate out God's law, if you separate out Christian law, then what is it being formulated from?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot we could talk about
Sure.
in this conversation.
I'm trying to keep it as
super
basic
ancient
as possible.
one.
Yeah.
You know, that this is the thing. I'm not without going into detail for one, because I'm no historian. I don't know the details to communicate, but just
Genesis 1.
reflecting, we'll ultimately go there,
yeah.
but I even mean in a worldly, secular human history, you know, from ancient Greece and further back, of course, we're looking at forms of government, ideas of government. Ancient Egypt, you know, the pharaohs, there were kings, there were political philosophies, and there was the pursuit of men trying to understand these things and order and systematize it and you know, looking out at the world we live in, but also understanding that there are these governing principles that are invisible, they guide us. And so, you know, since Plato and Aristotle, they've been, or I don't say since, but those point to historic figures thousands of years ago in, you know, it's a secular society, ancient Greece, that then goes to also formulate now our Christian ideas. And really, it does require at least a superficial appreciation for the reality of history. We don't live in a vacuum. History didn't just start now. We don't have to reinvent the wheel or come up with a new idea. Any suggestion that we should, and any effort to, you know, take our world in that direction is not only folly, but it's probably a sinister effort to lead us into chaos and destruction. And because there's someone behind that wants to rule. Yeah. And since the beginning, there's been someone, a one who wanted to subvert the rightful rule of the true authority and king.
Right.
Anyway,
but
breathe for a second.
We'll pause. But even when you said the Pharaoh, right? You said the Pharaoh was king, right? You could go that far back. You could go as far back as just England, right? Why did the people accept that? Most of the time they accepted it because they said, God has ordained this. The gods, Ra, has ordained me as the Pharaoh actually presented himself as the son of God. Right, as a son of God, and the people accepted that because he was a son of God, right? Mm-hmm. And so, like, again, worldviews matter, right? Which was very, you know, I would say that was very beneficial for the Pharaoh in his role, was that you believed him to be the son of God.
Yeah, how convenient for you.
Yeah, how convenient for you, and everyone else worked because he was God's son, right? But again, worldviews have consequences, right? But what we're pointing at is religion has always played a role, whether for the good or for the bad.
It's inseparable.
It's inseparable throughout human history and government. That's right. And now we're trying to pretend and have this new form of government that can be separate from religion, as if secular humanism is coming in and swooping in and saving us in some way. And it's like, it's actually not. It's destroying us. We just had to talk about a nation in decline. Why is it in decline? Because we're leaving these principal values that have been established through God's law and God's world and God's reality, and we're saying, out with those things. We're going to rule through secular humanism, and we're going to have our own way, and look what's happening, right? And we're losing our country. We're losing our nation because of that. So to your point, it's inseparable. These things cannot be separated, and nor did the founding fathers believe them to be so. Go back and read Jefferson's writings over separation of church and state. You have been conned. You have been deceived. They have used this language in a way that it was never intended, and no one ever thought that these things could be, right? But you've begun to believe this nonsense.
Well, and we've been convinced of that. But that really does get at then there are options before us.
I want to ask you this because I think this will be something you're about to press into. My question will be this. The question we need to ask ourselves is, why would you want to separate church and state? That's a good question.
Yeah,
why would the enemy, or I won't call him the enemy yet, why would you want to separate church and state? Why would you want to separate a state that is governed by God? That its rule comes from God, that has existed for 150 years, and it has become the greatest nation on earth through establishing its values and its principles and all of these things on this foundation. Why would you all of a sudden want to separate these things? What might be the intention behind the desire to separate these things?
Yeah, I mean, we're not really talking about separation of church and state. We're talking about the separation of God from state. People don't want God to be involved in the equation. So the separation of church from state is intended to reference these two spheres or domains of human activity. Yeah. And they are, according to the Bible, meant by God to be distinct spheres of human governance, and especially now since Christ in a new covenant era. There's the church that's established, but there's been a people of God who are defined by God speaking to them, revealing Himself, His nature, His ways, His commands for them, and they in faith obediently follow all that He says to do. And He works out His plans, especially through those people, and He blesses them along the way and protects them and does all these things, in particular for Israel. So we see a picture of that in them as a unique covenant people. And, this can get into, again, a lot of theological discussion. But if we try to translate some of the principles into our more modern times in this new covenant era of the church, we still are under God's rule and command for all of life. There is an underlying moral law of God that the Bible says is written on the hearts of every human being because we're created in the image of God. And so that is the thing that is alive, however suppressed, however turned down and dampened and corrupted, but it's alive in every human being. And that's the reason all human beings seek for and strive to know God, as well as to operate according to their conscience and order their societies along these principles. That's why we see that in the world. But then there's a right way to do that. In our ignorance, in our stumbling along blind, we make attempts at trying to bring order to our world the way that we're supposed to, but it's without knowledge. And so humans have made decent efforts along the way. But when God then revealed Himself to Israel, He did that in this definite, clear way, and imposed His law upon them in a way that was unique to them. And so sometimes God's interaction with Israel, and when we as Christians look to the Scriptures, it can be difficult, I'd say, and therefore confusing to work through and understand what does God mean by all this, and how do we live according to it now. So then, through some of that is how some of what we'd say is extremes of the theocratic worldview or theonomy.
That's what I was about to say. Talk about the extreme Christian nationalist movement that wants to go to like kind of this form of Israel, this top-down power, versus more of a Christian national movement, which I think we would more appreciate and take part in, which is, well, I'll speak for myself. All I'm saying from a Christian nationalist perspective is what you've been saying. If God's not above government, then nothing's above government, and government becomes God, right? And at the end of the day, no system throughout all of human history has worked well when government is God, right? It just doesn't. It's a power system, right? And it ends up being bad for the people. But the way in which Christianity comes into it is not top down, it's bottom up, right? It's like a plant, a seed that's been planted in this place and it starts to grow up around it, right? And all these people are living in the blessing of it because it grows up around culture, right? And we implant ourselves in these places as business and education and all these different politics and government and all these different things. And it just starts to grow all up around it. And everyone's living in the blessedness of it, right? And that's the way, a lot of the way, I mean, we could flush that out, but from a very simple position, that's what I mean by Christian nationalism versus the guy that might go, no, we get in leadership, we bring a hammer, and we force everyone around us to worship our God and to believe in our structure. And I would say, no, that's the secular system. No, that's the Islamic system. No, that's all the other systems, right? And I talk about this a lot. There's a difference between worship and structure, right? The only system in the world that doesn't force you to worship their God is the Christian system. But we do say you have to keep our structure, right? And that's the key, right? People want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. They want to go, well, we don't want your worship or your structure. And I go, okay, to your point, this doesn't exist in a vacuum. What structure are you going to take then? If you're going to throw out our structure, which has made us the greatest nation on earth, right? What structure are you going to insert in its place to replace that? And then this is back to my original question. Why are they wanting to replace that structure with the one that they're wanting to replace it with, right? What is the goals behind that? And this is where, whether you're a Christian, you're not a Christian, whatever, this is where you have to wake up because they're taking out a system that says that you're made in the image of God, whether you believe this or not, you're made in the image of God, you have value, you have freedoms, you have rights, right? All of this comes from the system, the structure of Christianity, right? You have these inalienable rights given to you by God that no government can infringe upon. Well, guess what? If we remove that and we put in a secular system, you ain't got no rights. You have no inalienable rights. The government can infringe upon you all day. Your molecules in motion, bro. Your DNA dancing the beat of your own drum. Your cosmic soup struck by lightning, lower life forms of critters, survival of the fittest, right? And if they as power, people in power can use you and get things through you and eventually kill you off and get rid of you after they have, they will. And they should, because that's the new structure, right? And so that to me is like what people need to wake up to. Right? You may not want to worship God. Cool, bro. You don't have to worship God. You don't have to worship our God. But it is to your benefit that you keep our structure, right? Whether you believe in him or not. And I think that's kind of what we're pressing into. And that's why Christians need to be involved in these things, right? We need to press into these things because the whole world's in trouble if we don't.
Yeah. I mean, we both need to be involved actively in our communities and we can improve at that. Some people, are serving and have that kind of heart and interest. But there's also, you can do all that, but without knowledge, then you might do it in vain, and that would be tragic. So that in this way, that's where we're coming in, talking about these ideas, because again, the ideas matter. What you believe influences what you do and how you live.
That's right.
So, from a Christian, if we want to look at this biblically, then we see that there is a structure. There is a hierarchy to creation, and God's at the top of it. So there is a top, and there's a top-down ordering of things, and the whole world is defined, of course, by what God determined it will be, and He made it though, and put humans in it, and for His purposes. So again, we look to Him to define our purposes as well as how do we do it? This is your mission, and here's how you get it done. God is the only rightful one in command of such a thing. So that's the proper hierarchy of the whole universe.
Yeah.
And so when we say it's in everyone's interest to conform to God's ways, then that's because of this truth, because this is how the creator of the universe ordered things to be. And only in cooperation with that is your blessedness involved.
Yes.
And when you disobey that, when you reject that, then you bring curses upon yourself. And so biblically, there's a real a fundamental thing that is happening through Adam, but there, in and through that, we also see, that's a true historic thing. I would emphasize, but yet there's also this principle of humanity that we see at work and playing out.
What you're drawing out though there is in the Christian structure is there's a starting point, right? And that's
God.
key. Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
His word.
But there's a starting point. There's a point of reference that we can all draw off of. In the new system of structure, it's objective. In the new system of structure, the reason we can't get anywhere is because we made everything subjective. There's nowhere to go.
There's no standard.
There's no standard. There's no point of reference. We're all lost